Purgatory. Catholics built an entire doctrinal system around it. Protestants call it fiction. And the Orthodox, who actually pray for their dead just like Catholics do, say the Catholic version distorts something that was never supposed to be defined the way Rome defined it. 3 traditions, 7 teachings, and a fault line that has never been closed. In October of 1517, Martin Luther nailed a document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Of the 95 propositions in that document, 8 targeted purgatory and the indulgence system built around it directly, not as secondary concerns, not as footnotes, as the core of his challenge. The entire commercial machinery of late medieval Catholicism, priests selling certificates of reduced time in an afterlife state, with the proceeds funding the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, depended on a doctrine that the Eastern Church had never accepted in quite the same form, and that Protestantism was about to reject entirely. This channel maps the actual doctrinal terrain between Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox Christianity. No agenda, no preaching, just the real positions as each tradition holds them. If that's the kind of content you keep coming back to, subscribe right now. We go deep on exactly this material every week. The first teaching is the one Catholics actually hold, and it's already more precise than what most people think they know. The Catholic Church does not teach that purgatory is a place of punishment. That distinction matters enormously because the popular image of purgatory, souls writhing in fire, serving out sentences for bad behavior, is not what the magisterium has defined. What the Church defined at the Council of Florence in 1439 and confirmed at the Council of Trent across sessions in 1547 and 1563 is this: souls that die in God's grace and friendship but are still imperfectly purified undergo a process of purification after death before entering the beatific vision. The Catechism of the Catholic Church restates this in paragraphs 1030 through 1032. The technical language is precise in a way that the popular version never is. There is a distinction in Catholic theology between 2 categories of what sin produces. The first is guilt, reatus culpae, which is the state of being separated from God by a grave moral act. Confession and absolution remove this. If you die in a state of mortal sin without absolution, Catholic theology holds that hell, not purgatory, is the destination. Purgatory is not for the unrepentant, it's for those who died in grace, forgiven of guilt, but who still carry what the tradition calls temporal punishment, reatus poenae. Think of it this way: a father forgives his child for breaking a window. The relationship is restored. The child is no longer in trouble, but the window still needs to be fixed. Catholic theology holds that the soul that dies, forgiven but imperfect, still carries the weight of the damage it caused, in spiritual terms, and that this weight must be addressed before the soul can bear the full weight of God's presence. That's the first teaching. Purgatory as purification, not punishment. And this is where the Orthodox and Protestant objections begin. But they begin in very different places. The second teaching concerns the historical construction of this doctrine, because purgatory, as a codified theological system, has a development history, and that history is not ancient in the way that, say, the doctrine of the Trinity is ancient. Prayers for the dead appear in early Christian texts. Tertullian, writing in the late 2nd century, mentions offerings made on behalf of the dead on the anniversary of their death. Cyprian of Carthage, in the 3rd century, distinguishes between different categories of the deceased when discussing how the Church should treat those who had lapsed during persecution. None of this constitutes a doctrine of purgatory in the Catholic sense, but it establishes that intercession for the dead was a live practice from very early on. What these texts do not contain is the juridical architecture that became the Catholic doctrine, the distinction between guilt and temporal punishment, the idea of a treasury of merit, the formal connection between indulgences and the reduction of that punishment. Augustine of Hippo, in the early 5th century, begins to sketch something closer. In his City of God and in his Enchiridion, Augustine allows for the possibility that some souls are purified after death by a kind of fire. He is careful. He doesn't define the mechanism. He describes it as a probability, not a certainty. The certainty comes much later. Thomas Aquinas, in the 13th century, systematized what had been a pastoral intuition into a formal theological structure. The supplement to his Summa Theologiae, questions 69 through 72, treats the condition of souls after death, the nature of purgatorial fire, and the effect of prayers and suffrages on the souls undergoing purification. By Aquinas' account, purgatory operates according to a coherent logic that connects the sacrament of penance, the remission of temporal punishment, the role of the Church as mediator, and the communion between the living and the dead. This is the architecture that will be formally defined at Florence and Trent. Here is the piece that almost nobody mentions in casual conversation. The Council of Florence in 1439, the same council that produced the formal definition of purgatory, was a reunion council. Its entire purpose was to heal the schism between Rome and Constantinople. The Orthodox delegates were present. The definition of purgatory was reached in that context, and the Orthodox signed the agreement temporarily. Within years, the reunion collapsed. The Eastern churches rejected the Florentine formulations, which leads directly to the third teaching. The Orthodox position on purgatory is not simply "we don't believe in it." That framing, while common in Protestant Catholic debates, misrepresents what the Eastern Church actually holds and what it rejects. Orthodox Christianity has prayed for the dead since before any formal Christian theology existed. The liturgical calendar includes dedicated Saturdays of the departed, called Soul Saturdays, spread throughout the year, where the entire community prays specifically for those who have died. The Divine Liturgy of John Chrysostom, used in Orthodox churches every Sunday, contains explicit intercessions for the reposed. The Synodicon of Orthodoxy, a document read aloud on the first Sunday of Lent in Orthodox churches, affirms the intercession of the saints and the efficacy of prayer for the dead. None of this is contested within Orthodoxy. It's liturgically embedded. What Orthodoxy rejects is the Catholic theological framework built around that same practice. Specifically, 3 elements. The first is the juridical language of temporal punishment. Orthodox theologians, figures like John Meyendorff, George Florovsky, and more recently, Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, have consistently argued that the Catholic doctrine imports the logic of Roman law into anthropology. The idea that sin produces a debt with a calculable remainder that can be satisfied by specific acts of penance or transferred by indulgences belongs, in their reading, to a Western legal imagination that has no equivalent in patristic Greek theology. The Eastern Fathers speak of purification in terms of transformation, a process of growing capacity to receive divine light, not in terms of debt satisfaction. The second rejection concerns the specificity of the state. Catholic theology holds that purgatory is a real condition, distinct from heaven and hell, with a defined theological content. Orthodox theology speaks of the departed as being in a process of preparation, but resists mapping that process onto a formal category with fixed theological properties. The Eastern tradition tends to say, "We pray, we trust in God's mercy, we do not know the details of what lies between death and judgment." That epistemic reserve, saying less rather than more, is itself a theological position, not an evasion. The third rejection is the treasury of merit and the indulgence system. The Orthodox objection goes to the root. It's not just that indulgences were abused. It's that the underlying logic of transferable merit is considered a Latin innovation with no grounding in the patristic consensus. At this point, it's worth pausing on a question this material raises directly. Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism both pray for the dead. Both believe those prayers accomplish something real. But one tradition has built a complete doctrinal system around the mechanism, and the other believes the mechanism itself is the problem, not just the practice. Which position is more consistent with what the early Church actually left on record? If you've spent time in either tradition, drop your read on that in the comments. The patristic texts are available in both cases, and they've been read very differently. The Protestant position on purgatory is not a softer version of the Orthodox critique. It's a different critique entirely, and it starts from a different theological premise. John Calvin, in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, Book 3, Chapter 5, calls purgatory a fatal fiction. Fictio perniciosa in the Latin text. His argument isn't primarily historical, it's soteriological. If salvation is entirely by grace through faith, sola gratia, sola fide, then the idea that the soul must undergo additional suffering or purification after death implies that the sacrifice of Christ was insufficient. The atonement in the Reformed reading is complete. There is no remainder. A soul that dies in faith has been fully justified, and full justification means full readiness for the presence of God. The need for a purifying intermediate state exists only if justification is incomplete. And for Protestant theology, that's the wrong doctrine of justification, not just an add-on. The Lutheran tradition adds a scriptural dimension. The primary texts used by Catholic theologians to support purgatory: Cact Maccabees, 1246, where Judas Maccabeus offers prayers and sacrifices for fallen soldiers who had died wearing pagan amulets; 1 Corinthians 3:15, where Paul speaks of a man being saved as through fire after his works are consumed, are, in the Protestant reading, insufficient to establish a doctrine. 2. Maccabees, critically, is not part of the Protestant Old Testament canon. It appears in what Protestants call the Apocrypha, texts included in the Catholic Old Testament, but excluded from the Hebrew Bible and from the canon established by Protestant reformers on the basis of the Hebrew scriptural tradition. This creates a structural problem that rarely gets discussed directly. The Catholic theological case for purgatory depends partly on a text that Protestants do not recognize as scripture, and the Catholic inclusion of 2 Maccabees in the canon was formally confirmed at the Council of Trent, the same council that defined purgatory as dogma. These two decisions reinforce each other in the Catholic system and contradict each other in the Protestant one. The Orthodox, for their part, include 2 Maccabees in their Bible as well, but interpret it as supporting prayers for the dead in general, not the full Catholic doctrinal apparatus. The fifth teaching is the one that brought down the first domino in 1517, and it remains the most theologically complex piece of the entire system. Indulgences are not a corruption of Catholic theology. They are a direct, logical consequence of it. If temporal punishment is real, and if the Church holds the authority to remit that punishment through the merits of Christ and the saints, then indulgences are the formal mechanism by which that remission is applied. The doctrinal foundation is what theologians call the thesaurus Ecclesiae, the treasury of the Church. This treasury is not a metaphor. It's a technical category in Catholic soteriology. The superabundant merits of Christ, supplemented by the merits of Mary and the saints, constitute a reservoir from which the Church, through its magisterial authority, can draw to reduce the temporal punishment owed by a repentant sinner. The distinction between a partial indulgence and a plenary indulgence maps onto this system precisely. A partial indulgence reduces some portion of temporal punishment. A plenary indulgence, when properly received, which requires sacramental confession, Eucharistic communion, a prayer for the Pope's intentions, and complete detachment from sin, remits all temporal punishment. The soul that dies immediately after receiving a plenary indulgence in the proper dispositions, in Catholic theology, goes directly to heaven. Purgatory is bypassed because the debt has been fully discharged. What Luther witnessed in 1517 was the Dominican friar Johann Tetzel selling indulgences across the German territories, with the financial arrangement that half the proceeds would fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica, and half would go to the local Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz, who had borrowed heavily to purchase his ecclesiastical position. Tetzel's formulation, loosely translated as, "When the coin rings in the coffer, the soul springs from purgatory, compressed the entire Catholic metaphysics of merit, treasury, and temporal punishment into a cash transaction. Trent, meeting between 1545 and 1563, condemned Tetzel's abuses explicitly. It confirmed the doctrine of indulgences with equal explicitness. Orthodox theology considers the treasury of merit to be incoherent as a category. Salvation in the Eastern tradition is not the cancellation of a juridical debt, but the transformation of the person through participation in divine life, what the tradition calls theosis. A treasury of transferable merit presupposes that holiness is a quantifiable substance that can be stored and distributed. Eastern theology regards this as a category error, not just an abuse. The Reformers reached the same conclusion through different reasoning. Here is what makes the indulgence question so revealing for this comparison. Catholics, Orthodox and Protestants all agree that Johann Tetzel was doing something wrong. They disagree completely on whether that wrong was a deviation from correct Catholic doctrine or a symptom of what is wrong with that doctrine at its foundation. That distinction is not a minor theological nuance. It's the difference between a system that can be reformed and one that needs to be abandoned. Drop your position on that in the comments. The disagreement is genuinely unresolved, and it goes all the way down. The sixth teaching concerns the liturgical practices that purgatory generates, specifically the Mass as an act performed on behalf of the dead. The Catholic Church holds that the Eucharist is a propitiatory sacrifice, not merely a memorial, not only a thanksgiving, but a real representation of the sacrifice of Calvary that can be applied to specific intentions, including the relief of souls in purgatory. This is the theological basis for the Mass of Suffrage, also called the Requiem Mass, and for the practice of requesting Masses for a deceased person. Trent, Session 22, affirms this directly. The sacrifice of the Mass can be offered for the living and the dead, for sins, punishments, satisfactions, and other necessities. This produces a set of practices. All Souls' Day on November 2nd, the Office of the Dead, an ancient liturgical prayer structure dating to at least the 8th century. The practice of saying 9 consecutive Masses called a novena for a recently deceased person, and the broader tradition of anniversary Masses. Each of these presupposes a soul in an intermediate state that can be helped by the prayers and sacrifices of the living. Orthodox Christianity maintains liturgical commemoration of the dead as well. But the Orthodox understanding of what those prayers accomplish is deliberately less defined. The Church prays. God decides what the prayers affect. The Orthodox tradition resists specifying a mechanism, resists saying that the prayers reduce a quantifiable punishment by a calculable amount. The practice is near identical. The theology underneath it is not. For most Protestant traditions, the Mass as propitiatory sacrifice is itself a rejected category. If the Eucharist is a memorial and a thanksgiving, as most Reformed and Baptist traditions hold, then it cannot be directed toward the dead as a mechanism of relief, because there is nothing in the dead to relieve by those means. Lutheran theology holds a more complex position. The Eucharist involves the real presence of Christ, but the sacrifice of Calvary was a once-for-all event that cannot be represented liturgically in a propitiatory sense. Lutheran commemorations of the dead exist, but not as a mechanism of purgatorial relief. The seventh teaching is the one almost no one includes in these comparisons, but it completes the system in a way that reveals the full internal logic of the Catholic position. The canonization process in the Catholic Church is not simply an honor bestowed on exceptional Christians. Theologically, it is a declaration by the Church that a specific individual is in heaven, not in purgatory, not in an indeterminate intermediate state, but in the beatific vision. This matters because of what precedes canonization in the formal process: beatification, which requires verification of miracles worked through the candidate's intercession. The Congregation for the Causes of Saints, a body of the Roman Curia, conducts an investigation that includes examination of the life and virtues of the candidate, verification of miracles attributed to their intercession after death, and formal approval by the Pope. A miracle worked through someone's intercession is, in this system, evidence that the intercessor is present to God, which means purgatory has been completed or bypassed. The logic is hermetically consistent. Purgatory exists because souls need purification before bearing the full presence of God. Canonization confirms that purification is complete. Intercession of the saints is possible because canonized individuals are confirmed to be in the position from which intercession works. The indulgence system provides a mechanism by which that same treasury of merit, verified through canonization as real and active, can be applied to souls still undergoing purification. Every piece fits every other piece. Orthodox Christianity canonizes saints. The process is less formalized. Different autocephalous churches have their own canonization procedures, but the veneration of saints and the invocation of their intercession is as central to Orthodox practice as it is to Catholicism. What differs is whether canonization implies a verdict on the completed status of the soul's post-mortem condition. Orthodox theology tends not to make that implication explicitly. The canonized saint is venerated as someone who lived in such a way that God's presence was manifest through them, but the precise condition of their current state is not defined with the same juridical precision. Protestant theology, consistent with its rejection of purgatory and the treasury of merit, does not canonize saints. The Reformers did not simply remove a practice, they removed the theological infrastructure that made the practice necessary. If there is no intermediate state to complete, there is no need to verify that someone has exited it. If there is no treasury of merit, there is no need to confirm that a given person's holiness constitutes a contribution to that treasury. Luther's insistence that every baptized believer is a saint removed the categorical distinction between the canonized and the rest of the faithful. In October of 1517, the document Luther posted contained something beyond an attack on Tetzel. Thesis 17 questions whether the souls in purgatory are certain of their salvation. Thesis 18 says it has not been demonstrated from Scripture or reason that souls in purgatory are outside the state of merit. Thesis 22 argues that the Church cannot remit any penalty other than those it has itself imposed. These are not complaints about abuse. They are challenges to the architecture. To the same architecture this video has spent its time mapping. 3 traditions, 7 teachings, 1 set of practices around death, prayer, and the afterlife that all 3 share to varying degrees. 3 completely incompatible explanations for what those practices mean, how they work, and what authority underlies them. The Council of Florence tried to close the gap between Rome and Constantinople on exactly this question, and failed within a generation. Trent tried to clarify the Catholic position while condemning the abuses, and produced the definitive break with Protestantism in the process. The gap is not smaller now than it was in 1517, and it is not smaller now than it was in 1439.